Black Flag Resynced releases this week, but whilst everyone else is getting ready to set sail in a shiny new version of the game, I've still got some unfinished business in the original. Back in 2013, I had an absolute blast completing the story, but that's as far as I got. One specific achievement has sat incomplete on my gamertag ever since. By the book. To unlock it, I'll have to complete every optional objective and every main memory of the campaign. Loading the game up for the first time in over a decade, I was absolutely delighted to see my main sequence progress sitting at 87%. Naturally, I assumed I'd done most of the optional objectives along the way. I couldn't have been more wrong. It turned out I had only completed 40 of the 95 optional objectives, leaving me with 55 still to complete. Safe to say, this was going to take me a while. Working in chronological order, I began with Sequence 2, where I was missing 4 optional objectives. I'd already done one of the 2 objectives in Memory 2, with one still incomplete. Stay out of combat. With this being the very beginning of the game, I assumed it'd be an absolute breeze. As always, I was painfully wrong. Despite the objective description, you can actually assassinate enemies. The only thing that matters is ensuring that their detection meter never turns red. This all seemed simple enough until the game decided to send me into an enemy fort. What followed was almost an hour of me repeatedly getting spotted, restarting, and questioning whether I should even still be attempting to game as a 32-year-old. Depressing, I know. To make matters worse, I genuinely didn't realise I was allowed to attack enemies. Common sense would dictate that that was very much the opposite of staying out of combat. I only found out I could do this when, after 45 minutes of failure, I finally gave in and watched a guide. Unfortunately, no guide could fix my abysmal movement. I did, however, eventually make it into the locked room before escaping the fort and ticking off the first objective of the video. If every objective was going to be this much of a struggle, I feared that this challenge was going to take a whole lot longer than I anticipated. Thankfully, the next memory was a welcome change of pace. One tackle from above later, and I was already moving on. This positivity was rather short-lived, however, as the game immediately asked me to stay out of combat again. This felt even more intimidating. I'd only just struggled through this exact same objective before, and this time there were far more enemies standing in my way. Fortunately, my aging brain was starting to grasp both the controls and the gameplay mechanics again, and things went far smoother this time around. I tried my absolute best to be patient rather than rushing things, and I spent time watching the enemy movement patterns so I wouldn't get caught by surprise. I quickly realised the key here was making proper use of stalking zones. Whistle from cover, lure an enemy over, assassinate them, and then repeat the process. You do have to be slightly careful when it comes to whistling, however. If 2 enemies are stood next to each other, you may end up luring both of them and get yourself into a spot of bother. I did have a few close shaves, occasionally triggering the enemy's alert indicator. Fortunately, I managed to get back into a hiding spot each time before fully alerting them. Upon reaching the stage and interacting with the door, the mission ended on the spot. The very last objective in Sequence 2 was in Memory 6. Now, this one caused me some issues, and for once, it wasn't actually my fault. Well, mostly. All I had to do was kill 3 enemies from behind corners. You start this memory in the hold of a ship, and you get set up with 3 separate groups of enemies that make this objective incredibly simple. I genuinely couldn't grasp how I didn't do this during my original playthrough. Because this objective was so quick to complete, I decided to Google whether my progress would be saved if I just quit out of the memory. Now, Google claimed that the objective would be saved as soon as I completed it, so naturally I quit straight away. Upon checking, however, it hadn't counted. No problem, I loaded back in, waited for an autosave, and then quit again. Still nothing. It turns out optional objectives only count if you actually finish the entire memory. This was a real frustration. Some objectives could be finished within seconds, but if the remainder of the memory took a further 30 minutes to complete, this would really impact how long the challenge would take. After almost half an hour of clearing enemy ships and finally escaping the fleets, the memory, and with it the entirety of Sequence 2, was finally complete. Sequence 3 was up next, and I had way more objectives incomplete in this one. A total of 10 compared to the previous Sequence's 4. A number of these were rather trivial, with objectives such as air assassinating an ocelot, sabotaging alarm bells, and disarming and killing guards all being completed with little trouble. This sequence was the first time I had to complete an objective relating to naval combat, a set of mechanics that most fans of Black Flag absolutely love. I'm not a particularly good pirate, however, much preferring to keep my feet on dry land, but the ship objectives within the sequence were all pain-free to do, once I remembered the controls, that is. I'd almost completely upgraded my ship when I played the game all those years ago, so objectives relating to sinking ships with certain weapons were smooth sailing, due to the damage I could deal. The objectives themselves weren't difficult, the problem was that they were spread across 7 different memories. Even after finishing an objective, I still had to play through the rest of the memory before I could move on. I made it through to the final memory of the sequence with relative ease though, with 2 final objectives standing in the way of me moving on to sequence 4. Sadly, one of those objectives was another dreaded stay out of combat task. To my amazement, I only actually had to revert to the previous checkpoint once during this memory, after a slight lapse in my patience resulted in me being spotted. This mission did still take a while, however, due to the sheer size of the area and the amount of enemies spread out on the islands. After emerging from the jungle and ticking off the stay out of combat objective, I boarded the enemy ship, located my target and air assassinated him, taking off the 10th and final objective of the sequence. With this sequence now complete, I'd already reached 54 of the 95 optional objectives. That meant that, after only 2 sequences, I was already a quarter of the way through the outstanding work. Maybe this challenge wasn't quite as impossible as I first feared. Right? Sequence 4 was over almost as soon as it began. After looting 2 treasure chests, I was already moving on to sequence 5. Memory 1 tasked me with performing a running assassination on the guard. I was in and out within about 4 minutes, a record for me in multiple contexts.
That's what she said!
Memory 2 also looked straightforward enough. I needed to kill 5 enemies stunned by smoke bombs along with 4 gunners. The problem here was that almost the entire mission consisted of tailing enemies without being detected. That made picking off gunners far more awkward than I anticipated. By the time the tailing section finally ended, I'd only managed to kill 1 of the 4 required gunners. The game decided to do me a favour at this point, providing the perfect opportunity to knock out all 5 of the smoke kills in one instance. Unfortunately, you're then instantly tasked with a small chase sequence before the memory ends. I ticked off 1 objective, but I had to replay the entire mission to try and take out the 4 gunners again. My second attempt here wasn't much smoother. I kept picking both the wrong targets and the wrong moments to pounce. After multiple detections and failures due to straying too far, I ticked off my 4th gunner kill before playing out the rest of the memory. Memory 3 also took longer than I would have liked to get through. I had to use different types of darts on various enemy types here. I could get detected as often as I liked, but I still had to actually survive to continue through the mission. Between enemies discovering dead bodies and using the alarm bells to call reinforcements, and my complete inability to exercise any form of either patience or stealth, I'm almost certain I had the entire island on my tail at one point. Even Forrest Gump would have been proud of my running here. I did eventually satisfy the objective criteria, complete the mission objectives and escape the area, but that was another 20 minutes of my life gone forever. Not to worry though, on to sequence 6 we go. Sequence 6 introduced an entirely new challenge, underwater exploration. Using diving bells, Edward can explore shipwrecks beneath the surface. We had to loot 3 chests underwater during this section, but the second objective was a little bit more intimidating, avoid being detected by any sharks. Considering my recent history with stealth, I wasn't exactly feeling confident. Fortunately, the sharks only appeared right at the end of the mission, and slipping past them turned out to be far easier than I'd feared. The final memory in this sequence gave me rather a lot more trouble. It all looked quite straightforward: sleep dart 3 crocodiles, then skin 1 of them. Conveniently, the game gives you more than enough crocodiles to complete both objectives within the first minute. The game then decided to throw me a curveball. I somehow spawned into the level with just 1 sleeping dart. Luckily, skinning a crocodile gives you a bone, which is the exact ingredient needed to craft the sleeping dart recipe. Unfortunately, the crocodiles weren't actually the difficult part. The guards were. To top things off, I also got my ship so stuck at one point that I genuinely think Austin Powers would have been impressed with my handiwork. Whilst 5 objectives didn't sound like much, sequence 6 definitely overstayed its welcome. After everything I'd been through already, it finally felt like I was starting to get the hang of the game. There was still the occasional mistake, but for the most part, objectives were falling one after another. Before long, I found myself almost 3 entire sequences ahead on the final memory of sequence 9, and that's where everything changed. 2 innocent looking objectives stood between me and the double-digit sequences. Free 2 groups of pirates, and double assassinate Cockram and Burgess. Freeing the pirates wasn't too bad, the area was huge, but there was enough cover that I could slowly pick enemies off without too much trouble. Then I reached this slope, and rather fittingly, everything went downhill at this point. I had to somehow perform a double assassination on my 2 targets. Up until now, objectives like this had been straightforward. The targets were usually grouped close together, with plenty of rooftops or hiding places to work with. Unfortunately, not this time. The area was crawling with enemies, alarm bells were everywhere, and my 2 targets were tucked away on the extreme opposite side of the camp. To make matters even worse, the moment I was spotted, they would run away. I suppose somewhat unsurprisingly, they weren't particularly interested in fleeing together, which made a double assassination somewhat difficult. I spent nearly half an hour failing this one objective before finally admitting defeat and watching another guide. The last time I'd had to resort to a guide was all the way back at the beginning of the challenge in the very first memory. After breezing through almost 3 whole sequences, this one memory really took the wind out of my sails. I'd finally reached sequence 10 of 12, leaving just 16 optional objectives left to conquer. Naturally, the game decided to follow up the last memory with a stay out of combat objective, because clearly I hadn't suffered enough already. The next handful of objectives were a welcome return to normality. A few of the memories were still pretty lengthy, but the objectives themselves were all straightforward, which was a welcome breath of fresh air. I did admittedly have a few issues with sequence 11 memory 1, because Sam Fisher, I am not. I had the distinct displeasure of alerting a literal army of enemies on 2 separate occasions, and whilst I like to think I held my own during these moments, I did figure it probably more sensible to restart. Soon enough though, we were loading up sequence 12, the final sequence in the entire game. With just 4 memories and 7 objectives left, the achievement was finally within reach. The final sequence got off to a strong start. Memory 1 was just missing 1 objective. I had to play through to the end of the mission, which didn't take very long, before sitting on a bench and assassinating a target as he walks by. This was absolutely free. Memory 2 was equally free, 2 objectives outstanding, but they were both easy and very satisfying. The first one tasked me with killing 8 guards by destroying powder barrels. Finally an objective where I can go loud and cause absolute mayhem. Naturally, I overachieved here, clearing dozens of enemies within the first minute. Objective 2 was at the very end of the mission, but all I had to do was kill my target with a rope dart. Now, he clearly knew I'd been struggling, because he did me an absolute solid here. He somehow glitched onto the side of the ship, making him easy pickings. I obviously wasn't complaining as I traded his life for 1 optional objective. The penultimate memory decided to spoil the party at the final hurdle. After a 10-minute section of tailing a group of enemies, I received my final stay out of combat objective. Admittedly, I did struggle a bit here. I was getting rather impatient, just wanting to get the achievement done, and I was making a lot of poor decisions as a result. It felt like the enemies were simply refusing to cooperate, which was becoming something of a theme at this point. After eventually getting past this area, I then had to use 2 enemies as a human shield. Once again, my target wasn't behaving at first here, refusing to get his gun out, which meant that I couldn't even take a human shield. After 1 reset and a rather embarrassing death, we got this done on a 3rd attempt and ran away, leading us nicely into the very last memory of the entire game. This memory was broken into 2 distinct sections. The first section tasked us with reaching the observatory, freeing 3 groups of hostages along the way. If you alert any enemies during the sequence, they'll instantly shoot the hostages nearby, so stealth was imperative. Not something I really wanted to hear at this point. I utilised the darts, aggroing the enemies with guns, who would then shoot the enemies accompanying them, leaving me with a very easy takedown. Upon reaching the observatory, I then had just 1 objective left: kill 4 enemies using the observatory's defences. Deadly beams would periodically shoot up from the floor, and parrying enemies into these beams would instantly kill them. Ironically, surviving the section following this was actually much harder than the objective itself. Upon reaching Torres and putting an end to him, all that remained were the closing cutscenes. And then, after 13 years, in typical Xbox fashion, there was an awkward few second delay, but eventually... there we go. 100%. Absolutely everywhere. After 13 years, 95 optional objectives, and far more restarts than I'd care to admit, it was finally over. Honestly, coming back to Black Flag after all this time reminded me why so many people still consider it one of the best Assassin's Creed games ever made. Despite the rather frequent frustrations, I had a genuinely good time working my way through all 95 of the optional objectives. Of course, the real challenge now is deciding which achievement comes next. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'm going to spend a little bit more time being a pirate.